it a second to make sure actually up and running. Okay, we are live. Are you able to see the?
Yep.
Okay. We'll just give it a couple of minutes.
Yep.
You got it?
Yeah. Yep. It went away for a sec, but it's good now.
What's up, Brian, Kathleen? How you guys doing? We're just going to give it a minute or two. Stick around. We're going to let some people get in here, so hang tight. Make sure that the screen is still sharing. What's up, guys? If you're here watching, hashtag live, comment mindset, throw that little mind blow emoji into there if you've got it. Thank you all for coming. We're going to get started in just a second. I just want to give another minute. People are pouring in right now, so I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get in, get settled, get their popcorn before Jordan changes all your lives. On this live, see what I did there? It's a beautiful thing. One more minute and we'll get started. If you're watching, go ahead, throw hashtag live in the comments. That little mind blow emoji. About to get your mind blown right now. Let's make sure everybody's active. This is going to include some community participation, guys. So make sure you're paying attention. And let's dive in. All right, so welcome. Today, we are going to talk about the connection between psychological well-being and physical health. But we're actually going to take it even further than that. Jordan and I have been talking a lot about this over the last probably week or 2 weeks. And the more we talk about it, the more I realize how much this actually overlaps into other parts of our lives. So we're going to give you things that you can utilize everywhere. Jordan's with us. She's a licensed independent clinical social worker. She is living and working in Boston right now at a psychotherapy practice where she treats mental health and substance use disorder. So Jordan, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate you taking the time. For what it's worth, guys, she's also my cousin. I guess brains just running the family. I don't know. What can I say? But beyond being my cousin, she's an absolute rock star at what she does. So if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit more about your background, what you specialize in, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, first of all. I'm excited to participate in this tonight. So my background is in psychology and social work. I got my undergrad degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, and then a master's in social work from Temple University. From there, I have certifications and specializations in cognitive behavior therapy, motivational interviewing, mindfulness training, and trauma. So those are kind of my areas of expertise with my patients, and hopefully some of what works really well for them, your people and everybody listening in tonight will find really helpful and useful to them as well.
And we're getting comments already about other people in the family getting the brains too. So hopefully they'll get some use out of this. So tell us a little more about, because I know probably for some people when they hear who you work with on a day-to-day basis, it's easy to say, well, that's not me. How will this really apply? Can we take to our how does what you do align to people who don't have a substance use disorder or something more severe like what you regularly deal with?
Right. So these concepts I use with a wide range of my patients, and my patients are anybody with, a life-threatening substance use disorder or a serious mental illness on the really extreme end of the spectrum, to, just a Joe Schmo who is in college and having some stress about workload, or somebody who's in the middle of a life transition. So these concepts can be applied to anybody. They're not strictly for mental health disorders. They're not strictly for substance use disorders. And let's be honest, we're all a little bit crazy. So brains run in the family, crazy runs in the family.
Definitely.
We'll be able to use this no matter what.
Good. Awesome. I'm excited to jump in. Guys, if you're still with us, throw up the hand raise if you think now that this can help you out, and we'll dive right into the meat of all this, or the nuts and bolts, depending on whether or not you might be vegan. Apologize. So CBT, you mentioned, is a big part of what you do, what you practice, how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all connected. Can you explain to us kind of how core beliefs are developed and how they impact thoughts, feelings, and behaviors?
Yeah. So this is kind of the cornerstone of therapy. This is the cornerstone of what I do, and this is kind of the cornerstone of what I hope you all will take away from this. So thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are all interconnected, and they stem from our beliefs that we develop from childhood experiences about ourselves, others, and the world. For example, like, let's say I've grown up in a household, I wasn't allowed to leave the dinner table until I finished everything on my plate. I might have developed a core belief of wasting food is bad. In theory, yeah, wasting food, but as adults, we can see this with shades of gray and recognize that, okay, body says we're full, then we can just wrap up the leftovers and save it for another time. As kids, though, we don't have this gray perspective. We're very black or white, and that black or white view of the world creates this belief that these, core concepts like wasting is bad, that becomes more important than actually listening to our bodies. So we develop core beliefs about everything: diet, exercise, how to treat people. And as we grow up and our brains develop, we become more rational, we gain perspective, we mature, hopefully. But our core beliefs actually remain kind of stuck at age 5 or 6 or whatever age we were when the experience happened. So those core beliefs remain very black or white, despite our ability as adults to view things in shades of gray. So if we go back to the dinner plate example, me now as a 30-something-year-old adult, when I eat and feel full, but I notice that there's food left on my plate, my core belief about wasting is going to be subconsciously triggered, and then the CBT process takes over. So I begin to think I should eat that, or I don't want to waste that, and that triggers a subconscious emotional response, which might be guilt. So the combination of those subconscious thoughts about needing to finish my food combined with the subconscious feeling of guilt triggers the behavior of overeating. So I'm going to overeat now to alleviate those feelings of guilt. But the only thing I'm really noticing is the behavior, is the overeating part of it. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how CBT and the thoughts, behavior, emotion components tie into how those core beliefs are developed.
So we could kind of blame this on our parents if we really wanted to, right?
I think we can blame a lot on our parents.
But if we really want to kind of take this a step further, all things aside, these core beliefs, they're where our thoughts as adults stem from. They're developed as children, but they manifest as adults, whether they're good or they're bad. That's kind of how, we've come to this point today where, like you're talking about with the food, kind of overcoming that. So I think what I want to do next is get some examples of what this sounds like, I know we talked about the food example, but I think for a lot of people it may manifest in other ways. So some additional examples might help people to kind of really conceptualize this. And also, guys, if you're still listening and you have an idea of a particular thought distortion or a core belief that you've developed that you're aware of and have maybe overcome or are consciously working on, feel free to throw that in the comments and we can address that here. But while we're waiting on you guys, Jordan, if you'd like, and I'll move this over because I realize it's probably blocking the view, but kind of talk us through this a little bit, these thought distortions.
So if we go back to that example that I gave of the dinner plate just now, the thought distortion that I was pointing out in that example was that black or white thinking, which is also called all or nothing thinking. But there are all sorts of different thought distortions. And as we have experiences throughout our life and we develop those beliefs, we develop thoughts about those beliefs. And some of those thoughts are perfectly healthy and they are adaptive and they help us through life. They help us achieve what we want to achieve. A lot of those thoughts, unfortunately, are distorted. And some of the thought distortions, we might not even realize they're distorted and that they're causing negative consequences. So part of what I want to go over right now is some of the most common types of thought distortions and what those are like in real life. So black or white thinking, we kind of already covered that all or nothing, all good, all bad, no gray area type of thinking. Overgeneralization is the one that happens a lot. That means that we take one or two examples of something that happens and we generalize that to an overall pattern. So for instance, I'm in grad school and I get a D on one of my papers and I overgeneralize that to think to myself, well, I'm a total failure. Mental filtering is another one that happens a lot. This means that, if 9 good things happen throughout the day and one bad thing happens, we don't even see those 9 good things. We only focus on the one bad thing.
I think that probably happens pretty often. I know there's been days when I've let that one thing take over. I know I've been victim of that. I think you guys can probably all agree. Let's see the hands if you've filtered in that way. But go ahead, George, keep on.
Discounting the positive is similar to mental filtering, but discounting the positive is more so like you see the good things, you see those 9 good things, you rationalize that they're actually not good. So you kind of reject the validity of good things. So if your boss says, you did these 3 things really well today, but you got to work on this one thing, someone who is discounting the positive is going to say, well, my boss only those good things about me because he thinks I'm pathetic and he just feels bad for me. So, really discounting the fact that it is a positive. Jumping to conclusions is one that...
Let me pause you for a sec because I literally just got a comment. And mind you, you guys are on a little bit of a delay. I don't know if you realize that, but we knew this going in. And we just got a comment in that specifically stated, this makes a lot of sense. It's like when your boss tells you all you, but mentions that one bad thing. So they're right there with you. So you're hitting the nail on the head.
Exactly.
If you're wondering, go ahead, keep going. But we got you guys.
So jumping to conclusions is 2-part. If you fall into the thought distortion of jumping to conclusions, you're either mind reading or you're fortune telling. And these aren't literal reading, but so an example of mind reading would be if Corey calls me and asks how my week went, what goals did I achieve? How did I feel like I did towards my fitness and diet goals? I might think to myself, he thinks I'm keeping on track. So that sort of negative mindset where I'm telling myself that I know what Corey's thinking about me, I have no proof that he thinks that triggers all of a sudden an emotional response and potentially a behavioral response. The other side of that is fortune telling. So basically predicting bad outcomes in the future. So why bother even trying to start exercise? I'm just going to go back to my lazy ways anyway.
I think guys, my clients on here, so feeling like I'm doing that. Guess what? I'm not. I love you all. So let's cross that one out right there. But I think all of these, for me, as you go through them, and we've talked about them already, but every time we go through them, something new comes to mind where I've either, done it or felt it. So I think it's spot on. But don't let me stop you. Keep going. This is wonderful.
Well, magnification and minimization are very similar. Magnification is also known as catastrophizing. So like making something a catastrophe. So that would be magnifying one mistake while minimizing the good things, which is very similar to the mental filtering that we already talked about. But it also goes on the opposite side of minimizing a good thing as not good enough. These last three, you may not fall into as much, or if you do, they are a little bit easier to recognize. Emotional reasoning is when we interpret our feelings in just that one particular moment as being the fact of who we are as a person. So, for instance, I feel unmotivated today. I'm a lazy person, which kind of bleeds right into labeling, which is just labeling yourself as a lazy person or, an overweight person or a sad person. People do this a lot with sadness and anger. So I'm feeling angry right now. I must have a rage problem. That's a really good example of emotional reasoning and how that can bleed into labeling. And then this last one is personalization, which I think we all fall into at some point, but it's blaming ourselves for something that is not entirely our fault. Yes, we have some autonomy in most things, but for instance, it's all my fault I'm overweight, or it's all my fault that I don't run every day. So really making it about you as a person for the behavior that's going on.
Which some people might take as ownership, but in fact, it's actually this thought portion which leads to those negative emotions, those negative behaviors, correct?
Well, I think there's a very fine line between ownership and personalizing because it depends on the output. So if your ownership of a negative behavior is motivating you to change that behavior, then that ownership is adaptive and beneficial. But if that ownership crosses into personalization, where it's causing negative emotional responses and then negative behaviors, that's when it becomes distorted.
Makes sense. So I had two people chime in. I want to get your take on this. The first is overworking causes you to think you'll miss an opportunity. So a thought distortion, if you're not, maybe less so about not doing the right thing, but overdoing something, which could be potentially as detrimental as not doing something. Where does that fall? And thank you, Jimmy, for commenting.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It really all goes back to your thought process and kind of how those thoughts are going to be influencing your emotional and your behavior. So if you're, and if we go back to that CBT slide, it's in a circular pattern for a reason. It's not linear. It doesn't have to be the thoughts, then the emotion, then the behavior. Sometimes it's behavior of overworking that is causing the thoughts of, if I don't stay here and do this, I'm going to miss something. And then what's the emotional response that comes from that? Maybe that's stress. We all know that stress is not good for our overall well-being, but especially for our physical health too. So yes, you're motivated. Yes, you're, trying to excel at your job, but is it having a negative effect even though you're not meaning for it to?
Yeah, I think something I can definitely relate to. I know Liz and I have talked about that regularly, about kind of setting those boundaries where, you want to do more, that hard work leads to more work, but being able to kind of set those boundaries and not let it control you. Awesome. Jimmy, I hope that helps. And then we had another one where what I guess is less so of a question. We're have the tools or are aware of the tools, most of us, but not actually using them. The hard part is the behavior modification. It's difficult to be consistent. I'm actually going to take that one. I don't need to let you answer this yet because we are going to go that stuff. So stay there. Don't go anywhere. We'll cover that. We'll give you everything you need to simplify, because it should be simple, attainable to be able to do. With that, I do have a question. As far as all of these thought distortions, you gave good examples of where they would kind of be evident to us. Is it possible to be unaware of one of these thought distortions, but still have it be having a major impact?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's what usually happens with the thought distortions that do cause the most negative emotional consequences and behavioral consequences. They're so unintentionally well practiced that they've become ingrained and we don't even realize that they're happening. We don't pay attention to that inner monologue, and we just continue to reinforce it by not becoming aware of what's happening.
And I think I don't want to give away good stuff yet, but we're going to kind of go over some ways to combat that as well, to
Yep.
identify and combat, I should say. We're getting out of agreement too right now on the boundaries part. I think that seems to be a big thing for people.
Yep.
Talking about, especially with being home right now, that desire to work more than we usually do. So that's good. We're connecting people. If you're still with me, #live, give me a hand raise. Let me know you're still there. The mind blow emoji one, because that's what like to me. So good. So how do we stop the bleeding, so to speak? Where does change actually start?
So normally what we're most aware of is the behavior. It's easiest to, it's the most evident to other people. And normally change when we notice that there's a problem. Either somebody's pointed it out to us, or we've noticed, and I'll use that word notice quite a lot from here on out, but we notice a mismatch between our expectations or our wants and the reality. So this slide kind of goes into stages of change. Everybody goes through the matter preparing to make any type of change in life. It could be change related to substance behavior. It could be change related to diet, exercise. It could be change related to how you interact with people. So this graphic starts out at the pre-contemplative bottom step. So being aware of the problem, this is kind of the typical denial phase. And these stages, they're called the stages of behavior change. But it's really important to understand that this is not just behavior change, but it's stages of mindset change also. So your mindset in pre-contemplation is either that there is no problem that has been awareness yet, or you're in denial that the whatever it is a problem at all. Then you move to contemplation, which is where the awareness begins. You become aware of the problem, and you become aware of what you want to be different, but you're not really sure what to do yet. You're sort of standing there questioning, okay, where do I go from here? Next is the preparation stage, and this is where you begin to, as it sounds, prepare to take action. So this is a very determined mindset. This is a planning and prep stage before the action stage, which is where you begin to actually implement some of the changes in behavior that you want to see. The final one is maintenance, which is working to maintain the change that you've made in whatever the behavior is.
So we had someone, Kim, don't worry, we got you. We'll let you know exactly how. I mean, this is the steps of the process, and then we're going to dial it in specifically for you with some actionable things that you can use to switch those thought distortions. That was one of the questions that came through. From Pat, who's starting to put it together. He said, it's like when something bad happens as a kid and your parents take you for ice cream, and now as an adult, it's like, yeah, I'm going to go have a cheeseburger or a beer. Pat, it does happen, but now hopefully you're starting to understand why that's happening, and then we can put into practice a lot of what Jordan's talking about to work past those where it's not a reward or a punishment. It's a conscious decision that you've made yourself after kind of weighing the pros and cons. So this makes sense. This is behavior. And you talked about how CBT is not for a reason, but a lot of what it sounds like to me is that you have to change your thoughts in order to change your behavior in most cases. Is that kind of accurate?
Absolutely. So the kind of slogan, if you will, of CBT is that if you want to change the way you feel and behave, you have to change the way you think.
Love that.
And this relates to addiction and to substance use. If you've ever heard the term drunk, so a dry drunk is somebody who only stops the behavior. He stops drinking, but he doesn't change anything else. He doesn't change his dress. He doesn't change his attitude. He still thinks the same way. He's still angry. The only thing that has changed is the removal of the alcohol. And the dry drunk is very long. And it's very similar with any other type of change. If you're only addressing the behavioral part of it, it's probably not going to stick. You're probably not going to be able to remain in that maintenance stage of change for very long.
Yeah, I think we talk about that a lot. Speaking of boundaries, a lot of times it's about being able to kind of say no. So, it may not be the case of quitting something like alcohol or some other substance, but being able to say no to the things that are no longer bringing you towards your goals or don't align with your core beliefs, so to speak. So I think that's really a good analogy to drive home. So guys, if you're starting to connect the dots here, if this is making sense to you and striking a chord, #mindset for me, let me know that this is starting to work so that we can keep driving for you and give you some of these things to work on to take with from the end of this call. So is there anything more with regards to this particular slide that you'd like to add? Or should we move on to the next one?
We can move on.
So the next thing I think I would have a question is, I guess, we know we kind of got to change our thoughts to change our behavior, right? But how can we change the way we think, especially if in some cases we might be aware before.
Right. And that kind of goes back to the question that was raised earlier of, how do we change some of these distorted thoughts? Distorted thoughts would be easy to change. They're really easily recognizable, but a lot of times they're not. So the first step is going back to that awareness piece. So we talk mindfulness, and mindfulness is a super useful and versatile practice for mental health, for substance, for just general stress and overall well-being. And this is just very simply the practice of noticing. So as you can see in the slide, mindfulness combines three major components of being aware, being accepting, and being in the present moment. So mindfulness really as the practice of paying attention on purpose to the unfolding of experience moment by moment without judgment. And that non-judgmental piece of it is really the most important because human nature is to judge. We judge ourselves, we judge others, we judge experiences. So this is really the practice of noticing what you're experiencing right now and accepting that whatever it is you're feeling, that's okay in that moment.
So I want to take a point that you just made, because we had a comment come through talking about everybody's hashtagging mindset. So this is making an impact right now. But I think one of the main concerns, and someone voiced it, is staying in a positive mindset is difficult. And I think what I'm understanding from what you're saying, it's neither positive or negative. It's more about kind of staying neutral, so to speak, and kind of accepting where you're at and working with that. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Exactly. So if I'm practicing mindfulness, I'm going to notice that I've just had this thought of I'm a failure. And I notice that, and it makes me feel sad, and it makes me feel, upset. And it's all of these negative emotions. And that's not a positive mindset. But if I'm being mindful, I'm noticing and I'm acknowledging that, and I'm accepting without judging myself for having those negative feelings, and just, looking at it from a curiosity perspective is helpful. So rather than saying I shouldn't have this negative mindset, being more curious about the fact that you are having that particular mindset.
Makes total sense. So are we starting to get this, guys? Is this making more sense? Don't worry, the payoff is coming, I promise. A little longer, but we want you to have a clear understanding of kind of how you've gotten to where you might be at right now, how this all applies to you, and then we're going to those tools to make sure that you can incite change. Was there anything else with this slide, or should I have another question, but if you've got you off, because this is good.
Nope, go ahead with the question.
So once we understand this, how can we kind of check ourselves to make sure that we do stay on track with this? And I think more so, like, what's the risk if we don't, right? Because this all sounds good, and it could definitely help. But I think sometimes if we kind of look at what the downside is, and again, I don't want to make this a negative thing. We're talking about keeping a control of our mindset and being mindful. But if we don't, what's the risk, and how can we check ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tend to go through our everyday routines on autopilot, and practicing mindfulness, being mindful, is really the opposite, and kind of taking ourselves out of that autopilot mode. And the way you know if you're in the autopilot mode is if you think about, I always use the example of driving because most people can relate to the past, but if you're ever driving a route that you've driven 1,000 times before and you get to your destination and you realize, oh my gosh, I don't even remember turning on Elm Street or whatever. You know you turned there. You know you obeyed the traffic laws. You didn't crash. You didn't kill yourself or anyone else, but you weren't present during the drive. Your mind was elsewhere. You were worried about what you were doing later that day. You were worried about something that happened the previous day. You were planning. You were multitasking. You weren't present in the moment as you were driving, which for a situation like driving, okay, not into the world. But if we are on that autopilot mode for a lot of activities throughout the day, then we're going to be sort of mindlessly behaving without purposeful intent. And that's where the difference of mindfulness can have an impact, because when we start paying attention, we start operating a different part of the brain. So the really interesting part about being in that autopilot mode is that autopilot mode comes from the limbic system of the brain, which is the same part of the brain that houses our fight, flight, or freeze mode, part of the brain that houses and drives addiction. It's the same part of the brain that has anxiety, and it's the part of the brain that is responsible for survival. It is pure instinctual brain. So when we're in autopilot, we're not using the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that thinks logically, makes rational decisions, weighs pros and cons, and chooses mindfully. So you can imagine that if we're constantly allowing ourselves to just go into autopilot mode and operate from that survival part of the brain, we're not going to be making the decisions that we might make or changing our behavior in a way we could if we were being mindful and pulling ourselves into that frontal cortex, logical thinking part of the brain to make decisions. Does that make sense?
It does. And it ties back into kind of where we started with that black or white and the shades of gray of kind of feeling the need to finish. Liz actually just commented, it's like when at work, you're eating lunch and also having a lunch meeting. And then before you know it, you're grabbing at an empty plate because you've eaten all your food without realizing. I think right now, because of the situation that we're all in, most of us being stuck home, I think most of our brains probably look like this guy here on the left, where we should be, trying to be more mindful and get to that. It makes perfect sense. I think everybody is getting it. You guys want the payoff now? I'm guessing you do. We want to talk about what we can do to actually make, or better yet, to really gain control of our thoughts, of our emotions, of our actions. Let's give it to him.
So autopilot mode applies to behavior, but it also applies to thoughts. And that's where we tie it back to those distorted thoughts, because we might get so used to saying those things to ourselves that we don't even notice that we're saying them. So now comes, okay, how do we put this into practice? What's the big picture? The big picture is noticing. That's really the takeaway. They did a study, smoking cessation, actually. They had a bunch of people who like pack-a-day cigarette smokers, and they wanted to quit. And what they told the participants in this study was, don't try to quit. Don't do anything different with your routines. Don't do anything different with but just notice. As you're smoking a cigarette, notice the taste. Notice the smell. Be present. Be mindful. And what the study showed is that just the practice of being curious about your in the present moment changed behavior. So that's where I want you guys to start. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can do that. But practicing notice not only your behavior, because that tends to be the most obvious, but notice how you're talking to yourself throughout the day. Do you talk to yourself in a positive, uplifting way? Are you talking to yourself in a way that might fall into one of those thought distortion traps? The other thing that's really strongly recommended is to, and I know everybody hears that and hates the thought of that, because I think we all have this like Dear Diary concept in our head. That's not the type of journaling I'm talking about. So the type of journaling I'm talking about is more of like a log. So you can't change anything that you're not first aware of. We saw that when we looked at the slide with the stages of change. That first stage of change where you're in that pre-contemplation, you're in total denial. You don't even know or want to acknowledge that there's a problem. First step is building that awareness through tracking, and doing that through a written log can be really helpful. So if you're journaling either throughout the day or at the end of the day and kind of keeping track of, on your most successful days, how did you talk to yourself? What were some of the emotions that, those thoughts produced? Were they uplifting and positive thoughts that produced positive emotions, or did you have a day where you were, not so nice to yourself? And if your thoughts were more negative, did you have more negative emotions, and were your behaviors altered because of that? Once you start to notice and build up that awareness, that's when the change process can begin.
And I think that's a big thing. You brought it up, and I said I was guilty of it, is kind of how we perceive journaling, not being an accounting of the events of the day, but noticing how you're talking to yourself and being more conscientious of that. I think that's something that I can definitely be better at. And I know a lot of the people that I've talked to that are watching have felt the same way. So that's a great place for us to start, I think, and we appreciate that. But I do have a couple more questions now that we're talking about this, because a lot of what we've been focusing on is what you're eating, how you're exercising, if you are or if you aren't. But this obviously, there's this spillover where work, friends, family all kind of comes into play. So how does this stuff apply into our lives?
Right. And, ultimately, I think it comes down to the fact that people make change because they are unhappy or they want to be happier. It comes down to satisfaction with different areas of life. So dissatisfaction tends to drive change. And there's actually a study that shows that 40% of our overall happiness comes from intentional activity. And intentional activity is really mindful activity. So if we can practice mindfulness, intentionally doing things, interaction with friends and family, intentionally doing things at work that increase our, overall well-being, improve our mood. If we're being mindful and implementing those in an intentional way, we're going to see results, not just with the behavior that was a problem in the first place, but even in areas of life that we may not have realized could use improvement.
Yeah, I'm thinking to myself now that it would be a good way for me to kind of keep like a happy list of thoughts and some of the thought distortions that I have. And rather than, keeping like a journal log, but maybe notice, like you said, pay attention and notice when I'm intentionally doing those mindful activities that would bring me well-being, kind of what my thoughts are there. And then noticing when I have those those thought distortions and kind of keeping a list. I mean, would that be a good way to, because now I'm just thinking this off the top of my head. We haven't even spoken about this yet. I promised you no curveballs, but here's one.
It's okay.
I can see myself doing that kind of, and then comparing and saying, well, wow, if 40% of my overall happiness comes from this side, but I've got a huge list on this side. And now that I notice it, I can start to change it and move more things into that happy side and have everything, friends, work, family, health, nutrition, exercise, everything be aligned with what I'd ultimately like it to be.
Right, exactly. And, it's also noticing if, let's say an interaction with a friend doesn't go so well. And you, you reflect back on that at the end of the day and you realize that, you were kind of just reacting rather than responding in that interaction. Well, is that a pattern? Is that something that you've noticed before? How can you become more aware of that and intentionally go into future interactions with that friend or family member or coworker or whomever, with a different mindset of intentionally, saying or not saying something, whatever it may be. But that reflection piece and that log can be really helpful as a reflection tool to increase that awareness to be able to intentionally make some of those changes.
Makes total sense. It does. So I've got one more question for you and then we'll wrap it up. Guys, well, I'll tell you what, two questions. Okay. The first one, can this same process be used to enhance behavior or performance for those of us that are looking to take ourselves from very good at something to great at something, to be a separator that pushes us over the edge with performance?
So the short answer is yes. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse. You can't really focus on enhancing good behavior to make it great until you've really gotten a hold of the negative thoughts and the negative behavior. So I'd love to save that for maybe a future session. If you guys felt like this was a good foundation, we can definitely build on that in the future. But for right now, I think it's important to kind of start with the basics. Take what, concepts we've talked about today and try to apply those and kind of comes of that so that we can build on that going forward.
I think that's a great. I had a feeling that would be the answer. Guys, if you loved what Jordan had to say, if you'd love to have her back and kind of review what we talked about today and talk more about enhancing behavior, enhancing performance, some things we can really do to take it to the next level. Let's switch the hashtag from mindset to mindful because we're growing, we're evolving, we're learning. Let's go hashtag mindful. And if you want to, you can go hashtag Jordan Rose. Let her know how much you loved her. And we'll get her back here as soon as we can to do another talk with you guys. I can't thank you enough. I know from looking at the comments and the amount of people that have been watching, everybody is as thankful as I am. So I think, just to kind of put a bow on everything, if people are going to start to practice noticing, practice journaling, I know taking too big of a bite of the number on it, maybe to say, let's notice 2 or 3 things, maybe one positive thought and one negative thought and kind of start that way, or where would you people go?
I definitely recommend starting small. If you can, at the end of the day, it's a between positive behavior and one negative thought and the negative behavior, that's a win for the day. By better than you can do because this is forming a new habit and you to where you are now over, and this won't be an overnight either. So just start to practice with, one or things that you know every day.
That's awesome. That's easy. I think we can all do that. And I think what we'll do is we'll maybe have a little bit more interaction the next time we get you on here, and we'll talk kind of a little bit about what people have discovered as they've started to notice these thoughts and these emotions and how they're tied to their behaviors, what they're learning. And then we can take it, like you said, from out what we can do next steps to keep improving and feel. I think that's what today is: feel good, be happy, be healthy, and be able to spend time with our family and friends. Not have to do it over the computer, I know, but in the meantime,
absolutely,
let's do what we can. So again, I mean, the comments are pouring. Is going to be its own hashtag now all over the internet. Mindful is blowing up. I appreciate all you guys watching. Jordan, I appreciate all of your time and I'm going to end it right here, but we'll connect with you guys all later. And Jordan, we'll figure out a time real soon to get you back because this was awesome.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I really hope that this stuff is helpful.
Let's, I don't